Let's turn now to another issue that's gaining a lot of attention of late, Nick, and not all of it good. That is the U.S. decision to pull troops out of Afghanistan by a September 11th deadline. The Taliban has so far not cooperated with U.S. efforts to end violence in that country. There are serious questions, not only about what will happen to Afghanistan under some sort of a power sharing agreement, if one can be reached, but will the country backslide into the conditions that once allowed al-Qaeda to prosper? I'm very pleased to say that we're joined now by Cipher brief expert General David Petraeus, who of course led operations in Afghanistan as commander of U.S. forces. He is also a partner and chairman of the KKR Global Institute, which he established in May of 2013. He also serves on several boards and is a venture investor in some 20 startup organizations. Prior to joining KKR, of course, General Petraeus served as director of the CIA and served over 37 years in the U.S. military, culminating his career with 6 consecutive commands, 5 of which were combat, including the command of the surge in Iraq, command of U.S. Central Command, and command of coalition forces in Afghanistan. General Petraeus, it's very good to see you. I am once again going to duck out of this conversation. Nick's doing all the hefty lifting so far today, but I will be back as well when the two of you are ready to broker some questions. So thank you for being here. Over to both.
Great to be with you, and our dog is happy to be with you as well, as you can hear.
We love your dog.
She will add her emphasis to certain key points throughout this time, especially if the delivery man tries to breach the perimeter.
Excellent.
Good. Well, General Petraeus and Doug, it's an honor to speak to you today, sir. And it's a great privilege to talk about Afghanistan with somebody who's spent a lot of time there, who served his country there, put his body on the line there, knows more about Afghanistan than most people do. And as Suzanne indicated at the beginning of this, of her lead into this conversation, it's a particularly critical time. The president's announced that US troops will be out by the next anniversary, the 20th anniversary of the terrible events of 9/11. It won't be a surprise to you for me to tell you that this announcement caused some surprise in different Western countries and in Afghanistan itself. So I guess my first question to you, General, is, in your view, was President Biden's announcement a mistake?
I do fear that we will look back. I've said 2 to 3 years from now and very likely regret the decision. I fear it could actually be sooner than that now. You can see the Taliban on the offensive. The number of attacks has gone very high for Afghanistan. Very indiscriminate action in certain cases, such as the bombing of the school where the Hazara girls attended. Just as they were coming out of their particular session, they have 3 shifts, if you will, boys, girls, boys. You've seen targeted assassination operations. They've taken control of the 2nd largest hydroelectric dam, and they've been taking actions that they've not generally taken in the past, which is to destroy critical infrastructure. They knocked down a couple of electrical pylons, which were very vulnerable. I mean, these are things you may recall during Iraq, we had to protect darn near every one of them at various times. That's almost impossible in Afghanistan, given the size of the country, the Hindu Kush Mountains, the rugged terrain, and all the rest of the various locations that the Afghan National Security Forces are trying to protect. So I am very concerned. I should note first, I guess up front, actually I should note first up front, it's great to be back with you, Nick. The partnership of many, many years with you and to hear Alex was terrific. I do think you have a future on the BBC. I'm sure the contracts will be pouring in. I would just note for the audience, in my recollection, there was only one member of the UK Foreign Ministry who received the Director's Medal, the CIA Director's Medal, which is very seldom given out. Very stringent criteria, the director approves it, and that was for you with good reason. So thanks again for all that you did during your time. Beyond that, just an aside, keen to what Alex was talking about in terms of Western technology, about which I share his concerns. I thought it was hugely important to note something that was largely overlooked over the past week, where IBM announced that they now are producing the smallest, or can produce, they have the technology to produce the smallest microchips in the world. So they have leapfrogged TSMC and Samsung. That's a big deal because it comes at a time when I think a lot of Americans were asking, gosh, do we even have the technology anymore? Do we have the human capital, the ability, the innovativeness? And of all things, it comes from one of those companies that was looked at as a bit of a dinosaur, that it's had massive ups and downs over the years and not seen as the agile, entrepreneurial, innovative organization that some of these startups are. And lo and behold, they've had a huge breakthrough. Now it's years away and tens of billions of dollars of investment from having a plant that can actually manufacture that. But that is a significant achievement, and it comes, I think, at a critical time when, as I said, we still have a lot of questions, and we should continue to have those questions about whether or not we can indeed compete effectively. But that is an area in which we are years ahead, and that solidifies, frankly, in certain respects, that particular advantage. Beyond that, I also want to note up front that I very much want to see, obviously, the U.S. government succeed. I am in very broad agreement across the board with the emerging foreign policy. I think the world of the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, obviously the Secretary of Defense, with whom I was privileged to serve a number of times in combat, worked for me at least twice in combat, General Austin. So, and again, the others around them, Kurt Campbell and so forth, these are really world-class individuals. And again, the trajectory, I think, so far has been very impressive. There are just two issues that I would raise about which I have concern. One is very understandable because it involves a domestic base in this country. That is the lack of trade as a component of what is emerging as the kind of coherent, comprehensive whole of governments, or even whole of societies, with S on the end, by the way, because all of us together, as Alex suggested, is necessary for the U.S.-China relationship, the most important in the world. And hopefully we'll see that could perhaps be addressed at some point down the road when the president and his party can address legitimate concerns of labor, and you can get the kind of trade adjustment assistance that would be necessary to take care of those who would be disadvantaged by any possible return to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, et cetera. The other is Afghanistan. And what's particularly concerning here is the conclusion that you and I have discussed in the past, that Islamist extremism, yes, it's no longer the biggest plate that we have to keep spinning by any means. That the biggest plate is that which represents the U.S. and the Western-China relationship, and that's bigger than all the other plates together. But you have to keep a lot of other plates still spinning. And if you don't pay attention to the potential for reestablishment of sanctuaries by Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State in a place like Afghanistan, we may well come to regret that. Al-Qaeda has tried, as you noted, to reestablish that sanctuary. We have actually taken them out a couple of times in the past. The most recent one was a surprise because it was down in the southern part of the country rather than the eastern part in Helmand. But again, that continues. And of course, that's one reason, a primary reason we have stayed in Afghanistan. The other big reason is that it provides a phenomenal platform for the conduct of the regional counterterrorism campaign, not the least of which was, of course, the raid that Osama bin Laden to justice in the final few months that I was privileged to be the commander of the International Security Assistance Force. So we're going to lose that too. If we really take everything out of that country, and all means all, supposedly, where are we going to have the basis for our capabilities, our air power and so forth, which are crucial? If, say, some critical infrastructure comes under attack, including perhaps, the green zone, the embassy, what have you, well, it's going to have to come off a carrier. Well, you really don't want to park a carrier off the south of Pakistan, but that's going to be the closest you can get. I doubt that we will get a base in Central Asia states anytime soon. Maybe you get back into Karshi-Khanabad. That's not a short commute to the fight either, and I doubt that they will allow armed systems to fly from there. So maybe you get some drones and some tankers flying from there, and then everything else, especially if a carrier's not there, is going to have to come out of the Gulf states. And that's a long flight because you've got to go around Iran, basically out over the Strait, the Arabian Sea, up over southern Pakistan and into the country. For a drone, that can take 6 to 8 hours, which means that your loiter time is very, very limited. So again, these are big issues. Our 3,500 leaving means that also the 7,000 or 8,000 coalition leave. They will follow. And then you also see the prospect of the all-important contractors who are on the ground, keeping these sophisticated UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters, Hughes-500D Little Birds, the fixed-wing turboprop jets that actually are quite effective on that battlefield. These are the Afghan Air Force elements. And, you know, are they going to be able to keep those working if over time the contractors come under fire and eventually start to leave? And of course, then you have the whole prospect of what becomes a very significant human rights issue. Should the Taliban be able to return the bulk of the country to a medieval theocratic regime in which women are consigned to life in house arrest or behind a veil if they're outside with a male sponsor, and probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions of individuals from different sectarian, ethnic, and even walks of life leave the country because they don't want to live under that kind of regime once again, as they experienced it back in the 1990s when Al-Qaeda did have the sanctuary in which the 9/11 attacks were planned. So again, my preference would have been to just manage this problem, and we were managing reasonably well with 3,500 troops. Certainly, no one wants to end endless wars more than those who have actually seen and experienced the loss, the damage, the destruction, and all the rest of that that accompanies war. But given the alternative, we may again, 2-3 years from now, or perhaps even sooner, come to regret this decision. As you see, again, the toppling of a democracy, however imperfect, corrupt, and everything else our partners occasionally can be there, the elimination of the kinds of rights that women have enjoyed, the ability to be educated, and indeed then see a refugee crisis that results from this, which I don't think will be quite as bad as the geopolitical Chernobyl that has been Syria, the meltdown of a country, but it will once again eventually put enormous pressure on our European NATO allies, for whom the previous refugee crisis out of Syria and North Africa posed the greatest domestic political challenges since the end of the Cold War. So that's sort of I guess, a long-winded, nuanced explanation of why it is that I have real reservations, despite very much agreeing with the emerging foreign policy of a regime, of a administration that has a very talented national security team.
That's great. Thank you, General. Well, I made an unsuccessful attempt to get a British intelligence chief to look into his crystal ball, and he wasn't falling for it. So I'm now going to speak to a former American intelligence chief and ask you, at least, can you give me some sense of what scenarios you can see playing out after, you know, September, whenever it is the last American troop supposedly leaves Afghanistan? What scenarios do you see? Do you think the Taliban are just going to roll into Kabul within 6 months, or will there be civil war? Will warlords start ruling the country?
Yeah.
And the other thing,
I fear.
Do you see the Taliban is the same as in the 90s, or have they changed?
Well, that is one big question, of course, whether the prospect of becoming an international pariah, as our national security leaders have said, would be the case if they act the way they did back in the 1990s. The truth is, I'm not sure that they are all that concerned about being an international pariah. They certainly have had no constructive engagement. I mean, the agreement that was reached between the US and the Taliban really gave up nothing on the Taliban side, and it was very significant of what we gave up. We forced the Afghan government to release their detainees. Again, keep in mind the Taliban wanted two big gets out of this. They wanted their fighters out of detention in Afghanistan, and they got largely almost all of them out after we pressured the Afghan government. And then the second is they want us out. And they've gotten that without giving up anything that I'm aware of that is particularly substantive in return, and without ever negotiating directly with the Afghan government or indicating any willingness whatsoever to compromise, have an interim administration, participate in a democratic election, or anything like that. So it's very clear, I think, they're going to go on the offensive. The question then, there are several questions that begs. One is, how long can the Afghan air power continue to function? Again, there was a really fatuous comment out of the Pentagon last week, unattributed, that said we have to wean the Afghans off air power. Well, we wouldn't wean ourselves off air power. As you know, in that country, in the Hindu Kush Mountains, with very limited road infrastructure, and so it's so limited that if you cut one location, you actually can't get to the place you're trying to with a ground quick reaction force. So if that is the case, you have to have air mobility and you have to have close air support. And you also, of course, want the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets to tell you what's going on the ground as well, over top the Afghan National Security Forces. I mean, we never would employ our own forces without this being present, and in very substantial numbers and lots of reaction capabilities, including medical evacuation. And yet here we are saying, well, they need to do without this in a country where it is absolutely imperative. Let's keep in mind that when we introduced Stingers, that's what really was a key element in the Soviet withdrawal, because when their air power started to be knocked down and they were deprived that, they realized they had a really, really tough situation on their hands. There were a variety of other challenges, not the least of which was the looming collapse of the Soviet Union. And we should note historically that the post-Soviet government did survive for over 2 years before Najibullah, of course. First of all, they cut off the funding to him, and then eventually, remember, his fate was that he was swinging from a lamppost in Kabul after essentially a civil war in which the Taliban achieved control of the bulk of the country, and that included Kabul. Not all of it, certainly, but the bulk of it. And so one question is, again, just how long can the Afghan National Security Forces hang tough? Big question there is, how much do we continue to provide? Will we provide our own air power to support the Afghan National Security Forces against the Taliban, or is it going to be just against Al Qaeda and the Islamic State when we can determine that they are actually present in a particular fight? And then how much do we continue to support them in terms of the provision of hardware, of ammunition, of, again, weapon systems and all the rest of this? And can we keep the contractors there and keep them safe so that, again, the various sophisticated systems we have provided to the Afghans can continue to fly, drive, operate, what have you? Then, of course, the other question, as you know well, is what does happen with the warlords? And you will have seen, I think, at least 2 photos of different warlords with their militias sort of gathered around them as a bit of a warning about what could happen if indeed the Afghan National Security Forces cannot maintain security in those areas. Of course, these are mostly in the northern part of the country. And you would see, I think, then the ethnic and to some degree sectarian. You've had the Hazaras. Again, there's a variety of different, the Tajiks, Uzbeks, Turkmen, and so forth. They will all, Kyrgyz to a degree, they will all probably then, it's natural. We saw this in Iraq as well during the height of the violence there prior to the surge, where when all else fails, you fall back on your tribe, on your ethnic group, your sectarian group, your segment of society, if you will. So that is another big question, I think. How long does it take until they enter the equation? And then do you have a full-on civil war over Kabul, which is, of course, where they all converged the last time, noting that at least one of those groups is actually reconciled and is back sort of a participant in the governing system there. But the others, the most significant ones, of course, the Taliban, their Haqqani Taliban, if TTP gets involved, the Pakistani Taliban, the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, Al Qaeda, the Islamic State, and there's a bunch of others, as you know, minor ones. If they all again converge on Kabul, that would be a very, very nasty, brutal, and potentially again, once again, devastating blow to a capital that has really come back very impressively over time, over the past 2 decades. So these are the kinds of considerations, I think, and some of these I think are just unknown because I suspect policy decisions have not yet been reached on some of the elements of what I've just discussed, particularly whether we're going to use our air power to shore up the Afghan National Security Forces in a full-on fight against the Taliban if there's a particular collapse that is imminent.
So I think there's a clear message in what you say, General, that despite the decision to withdraw, which clearly you don't support, there are some decisions that the United States can take that would have a big impact on the viability of the Afghan government after the Americans have pulled out.
I think that's exactly right, Nick. But it is going to be much more difficult to take it unless we say retain a base somewhere in the country. And I mean, I certainly hope. Obviously, I have talked to certain of old comrades in different locations and everything else. And what I haven't mentioned is that obviously all the other activities have to draw down too. Presumably, intel activities and whatever they may support in that country. You can't do a lot of that without the military footprint within which you operate or from which you operate. The same is true, frankly, of development activities. And again, if AID is going to be severely constricted, and again, we'll be operating even more than ever through operating partners. And that's very, very challenging. It often can lead to corruption payoffs to the Taliban to enable them to carry out what it is that they're trying to do. So I think all of the different activities. I should note another concern that very different from Iraq, Afghanistan really needs the international organizations and the NGOs and IOs and all these different entities that provide a lot of services for the Afghan people that the government cannot provide for them. Keeping in mind that there are huge differences between Iraq and Afghanistan. And just quickly, when I was coming home from the 3-star tour in Iraq, Secretary Rumsfeld characteristically, your reward for doing something for him is you get to do something else. And that was, by the way, on your way home from the latest 15.5-month tour, come through Afghanistan and do an assessment. So I did that. We looked at all these things. And when he came back and I presented the briefing to him in the Pentagon, the first slide in that briefing was titled, Afghanistan does not equal Iraq. And what I was getting at is that the differences are massive. I mean, the very first, of course, and the most frustrating is that the enemy headquarters, the insurgent and extremist group headquarters, are outside the country. You can't get to them. There's a reason the Taliban leadership is the Quetta Shura. It's because they're located outside Quetta, the capital of Baluchistan province of Pakistan, and our Pakistani partners are just never either willing or capable of actually dealing, or a combination of those two, dealing with these and taking them off their soil. The Haqqani Network, North Waziristan, most of the other groups in the stands of the used to be known as the federally administered tribal areas or the Northwest Frontier Province, now Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And so huge frustration. The second is they have no money. Iraq actually had $100 billion if the oil prices were high and we could get the pipelines patched up and the towers pumping electricity back up to enable it all. Very, very limited infrastructure in Afghanistan compared to Iraq. Limited literacy, so every category that a counterinsurgent commander would assess is just incredibly more difficult, which is why I told Congress when I had the confirmation hearing for commander of the International Security Assistance Force that we would not be able to do in Afghanistan what we did in Iraq specifically. We're not going to flip this. We're not going to drive violence down by 85% and keep it down, as was the case in Iraq for the next 3.5 years after the surge. It's a very, very different situation, and the terrain matters, as I mentioned earlier. So all of these are huge differences. And again, if we actually completely pull out and then decide, gosh, we need to provide air power for them, boy, you're gonna have a tanker demand for air refueling that is going to be just extraordinary. Even for an aircraft coming off a carrier, they come off and they immediately tank. They go in, they probably tank while they're overhead, and then as they come out, they tank again to get back. I was just talking with somebody who did a lot of flying off the carrier south of there. In fact, the Abraham Lincoln, when I was and went down to meet with, by the way, with General Kayani and General Pasha at that time, together with Admiral Mullen. So do we keep a base, in the north, let's say? It'd be interesting to see if we rethink this at some point in time when we recognize the enormous logistical challenges that we're about to encounter if we fully pull out of all these. And again, giving up Bagram and Kandahar, although they will go to the Pakistan or the Afghans, that notwithstanding, again, whether those bases can be maintained, secured, et cetera, is going to be in question, because you could get in situations where everything has to be flown in and out, and there's just a limit. There's no C-17s in the Afghan Air Force.
Very interesting. Well, you mentioned Pakistan a couple of minutes ago, General, and it always seemed to me when I was in Afghanistan that you were never going to get peace without the active involvement of at least some of the regional players. And you've got some really interesting regional players there, Pakistan, India, China, Russia, the Central Asian republics. You've got the Saudis looking at it with interest. You've got the Turks, with some people have said the Turks could have a greater role. So there's a lot of interested regional or almost regional powers. What role do you think these regional powers will take? There's a lot to get through there, but the critical ones, particularly, say, Pakistan and China, what do you think they're going to do when the Americans pull out?
First of all, I think the only one that really, truly matters is Pakistan. I don't see any of the others filling the void when it comes to real combat power, air power, big amounts of money, hardware, weapon systems, you name it. I just don't see that forthcoming from any country. Certainly, China doesn't want to see extremism make its way out that little sliver of land that does connect with Afghanistan, but it's under snow for probably 2/3 of the year anyway. Russia doesn't want to see extremism coming up through the Central Asian states, their former republics, into Russia, or the illegal narcotics. But I don't think they'd ever think of putting stuff back on the ground. So the only real country that could truly make a huge difference would be Pakistan, because it's on Pakistani soil that the headquarters of these organizations reside. And I just don't see that happening. I mean, if they didn't do it when we had 150,000 troops on the ground, and Richard Holbrooke and I went to Capitol Hill to get an additional $1.5 billion in economic assistance for each of the subsequent 5 years, in addition to the $2 billion we were already providing in a variety of different foreign military sales, counterterrorism support funds, and this kind of thing. If we couldn't get it then, and if we couldn't get an agreement with the Taliban then, you're not going to get it again when we're basically going home. So they're going to try to figure out what deals do they cut, how do they try to have influence. They should be very concerned about the possibility of a civil war, Taliban control, which would result in, again, perhaps millions, certainly at least hundreds of thousands of refugees flooding into Pakistan, as they did it in the past. I mean, they're still trying to get refugees back to Afghanistan from Pakistan. Iran could be a bit less meddlesome than they are, but again, not going to be transformative. They basically support some of the Taliban that are contiguous to the areas that border Iran. Again, I don't see much involvement there. And then the Gulf states certainly could provide some financial assistance in certain respects, but I don't see anything there that would be, again, really definitive or really, again, material. So that's sort of how it breaks out. And I think it really comes down to what will the U.S. continue to do? If we continue to do something, could some of the coalition partners continue to assist? And what could Pakistan actually do that would be constructive? And frankly, I just do not expect that to happen. There have been repeated compromises with elements on their soil, with a couple of exceptions. And the biggest exception, of course, is the Pakistani Taliban, the Tariqi Taliban Pakistani, that they went after when they had the TTP-controlled SWAT, which was like a dagger pointed at Islamabad. And they did a very impressive campaign, as you'll recall, in SWAT, then Baijur, Moman, Khyber, Orzai, and South Waziristan, but never closed North Waziristan. Our hope, frankly, at that time, and that was when I was a Central Command commander, we were providing a lot of support to our Pakistani partners in a whole variety of different ways, was just squeeze North Waziristan really, really hard and then allow other actions to take place. And perhaps we could really make a dent in the problem. But that just didn't prove possible. And nor did any pressure ever with respect to Baluchistan, where my sense was that there was no willingness and perhaps even some kind of agreement that the military of Pakistan, the army, would do anything more than run the staff college in Quetta and maintain the border posts. And that was about it.
Right. Okay. Well, that's pretty sobering. You know, some people would say, well, if the US couldn't influence Pakistan when it had a huge number of troops in Afghanistan, it's not going to influence Pakistan now.
No, I think that's probably true. And, you know, of course, Pakistan just has so many challenging issues with which to deal. Pretty rapidly growing population, water shortages, either water shortages or water overages, of course, when you have the terrible floods in certain times of the year. A whole variety of essentially either extremist or ultra religious organizations that pose enormous problems for Pakistani society. The education system has eroded, and there are so many, if you will, imperfections or intrusions into the economic system itself, with subsidies for, you know, electricity, refined fuels. I think even sugar may be one. Again, and they all require hard currency. And there are often really serious challenges about that. I remember when I took over as commander of U.S. Central Command in late October, I think it was, of 2008, after the surge in Iraq. The first time I went to Washington, my very first office call was not actually at the Pentagon or State Department or White House. It was actually at the World Bank to see Bob Zoellick and ask if they could help Pakistan with its hard currency challenges, which were becoming very, very serious at that time. They got out of that. They've had some since then periodically. But again, there are distortions to that economy as a former economics professor that almost cannot be fixed, because the population is so used to them that if you actually try to charge what it actually costs for refined fuel or electricity, or make people pay taxes or whatever, you have a million-man march on your doorstep in the morning, and you end up backing down. And so all of these compromises over the years with different groups in society, with various elements of the economy, it makes it almost impossible to fix unless you have enormously strong leadership and a period of real support, and people willing to tighten their belts even more than they already are, noting that there is enormous challenge there economically for a large number of the population.
Yeah. Great. Okay, Joan. Well, I mean, there are lots of more questions I'd like to ask you, but I think I'd better try and be generous for a change and let somebody else put some questions to you. Suzanne.
Thanks, Nick.
Thanks.
Hey, Nick, thank you. I've been very closely following the conversation. I think it's fascinating. We do have a number of questions coming in from some other experts as well. And this one from Sir John Scarlett, who also says, General, these are very good comments and questions being asked. Two questions from him. First, is it right to call this an endless war? He says the deployment is now much smaller. It is an extended, is it more of an extended sort of campaign instead of a war, which, you know, words matter, as you know, and that's been carrying a message. The second question, what is the wider message of withdrawal, and will vulnerable countries be able to rely on US and allies in the future?
Yeah, I think that second question is a really good one, because it has been largely overlooked. And I'll come to that just in a second. I think, you know, endless war, or whatever you want to call this, I think actually I've toyed with the idea of actually having an op-ed that said, stop trying to end endless wars. We shouldn't try to end them. We should try to manage them. And what you need, in fact, against Islamist extremists, I think we have learned, because it's a generational struggle, not the fight of a decade, much less a few years. There's no hill to take, flag to plant. You don't, you know, get them out of this and then go home to a victory parade. You have to stay with it. We learned that in Iraq. We have learned that in other places where we've tried to withdraw and then we realize that we have to go back in. And if you have a sustainable sustained commitment, sustainability being measured in the expenditure of blood and in treasure, then I think it should be sustained. And that's why I do have, and I thought 3,500 troops, my gosh, I mean, that's more than sustainable, even noting the imperative of absolutely rebalancing our focus and everything. The main effort, unquestionably, the plate bigger than all the others, is the one that deals with the US and the Western relationship with China, the Indo-Pacific, and so forth. And actually, this could have some implications for that, because again, if you're not willing to maintain 3,500 troops in the country where extremists planned the 9/11 attacks, Al-Qaeda, when the Taliban controlled that country and allowed that sanctuary, and the Taliban also have been completely reticent about saying whether they would do anything to Al-Qaeda unless it's in these secret agreements that are revealed to the enemy, but not to the U.S. population, which is somewhat paradoxical in and of itself as well. But I mean, are you really going to count on the Taliban to be our counter-terrorist force in Afghanistan? Again, that calls into question some other things. But the idea that you can't sustain 3,500 troops there, does this become the kind of indicator that, well, maybe we won't be so firm elsewhere? I'm not entirely certain of that, because the administration has gone to great lengths, including in the president's speech when he announced the withdrawal, to note that this does not have any implications for, again, our willingness to again be firm with, again, China, Russia, etc. Because you can argue back in the previous administration that when the red line didn't turn out to be a true red line, that had repercussions in the South China Sea, in Ukraine, with Russia, and in a variety of other of those who wish us ill. So I think that is a legitimate question. I'm grateful to John for raising it, and also grateful to John, I should note, for another phenomenal partner over the years. Especially, I should just note, when he was carrying out somewhat secret negotiations meetings with Bashar al-Assad, I was not allowed to meet with Bashar al-Assad as the commander of Central Command, although I proposed it, and was told to sit under a tree until the thought passed. So John graciously was already going in and used to call up and say, you know, what should be the emphasis this time? Sadly, we were never able to convince Bashar that he shouldn't allow Al-Qaeda facilitators to have a space in Syrian soil. And in fact, our argument was, you know, you're allowing poisonous snakes in your own to have a nest in your backyard with the understanding that they don't bite you or your kids. They just bite the neighbor kids, and that's what those facilitators were doing, allowing 100 to 110 suicide bombers to go into Iraq, facilitating it per month, at least until we cut it down to well below 10 at the end of the surge. But ultimately, of course, they did turn around and bite the backsides and the neighbors' kids, their kids, and themselves. But so John has raised, again, a characteristically good point, and it's one that should not be overlooked as well. Does this have implications elsewhere? By the way, I think we have to take a look in this regard. The previous administration, the U.S. also pulled our forces out of Somalia, out of Mogadishu, where we had quite a very small, capable special operations and intelligence effort ongoing. And that also is one that needs to be relooked, because what we were doing there was not resolving the challenges of al-Shabaab, we were managing. And that's what you need to do, I think, all around the world. Wherever you have ungoverned spaces in the Muslim world, extremists will exploit them. You have to do something about it. We have to lead. It should be a coalition. It should include Muslim countries. And it should be, over time, sustainable and sustained. And I think we have figured out how to do that with the proliferation of drones. This armada that we can put in the sky is truly a game-changing, a work-changing technology that enables us to not have to fight on the front lines, but we can advise, assist, and enable host nation forces that are doing that, as we have done with the Iraqi forces and the Syrian Democratic Forces in the fight against the Islamic State as an army, and defeated and destroyed that caliphate, although they're still there again as insurgent and terrorist groups. And once again, they also need to be managed, but again, through our partners, which is what we're also attempting to do, certainly in Afghanistan.
A question here as well from Larry Pfeiffer, who of course has worked over the years at the agency and closely with General Hayden. He now manages the Hayden Center. Let me, you mentioned before I get to Larry's question that there's no short commute to the fight if the United States does need to, for any reason reinsert itself, if that scenario were to occur. You also talked a little bit about the drawdown of intelligence and development and the impacts that might have. And Larry's question, he says, as a former commander in theater, what intelligence requirements would be vital to U.S. and allied success in Afghanistan after this withdrawal, which I think is an excellent question.
Well, it's a wonderful question, and it has been addressed.
I'll let you answer that first.
Yep. The president again sought to address this. Tony Blinken and others, Jake Sullivan, have sought to address it as well, and to assure us that because of improvements in intelligence collection capabilities, which there have been many, including, as I mentioned, the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets that we can put overhead certain activities, et cetera, and because of changes to just the intelligence organizations, the establishment of the DNI, the integration that, so that we don't fail to connect the dots as we failed to do prior to the 9/11 attacks. When they went back and looked at that and examined, and it was all there, it just was never all put together. So there have been very significant improvements since then, and there have been improvements just literally in the last 10 years in certain technological areas and others. And so there has been an assurance that we will be able to spot, to identify, to pick up any signs of the reestablishment of it in Islamist extremist sanctuary. Again, a lot of this is going to be done from afar. It is much tougher to have an unblinking eye over a country if each platform of that unblinking eye has to fly 6 to 8 hours just to get to the location where it's going to bore those holes in the sky. So what used to be maybe you could do this with 2.5 or 3 platforms, you may actually have to have more than that for each unblinking eye, and that means more crews, more this and that. So I think this creates some very substantial additional challenges. And of course, Nick knows at the end of the day that the coin of the realm, I think still, and others know this as well that have been in this business, it's still about human intelligence. And of course, you have to sort of be there. And if it's more difficult to move around and so forth, let's keep in mind that when we had to collapse the footprint in Iraq, everyone took their eye off the Islamic State, and folks missed the fact that the Islamic State was reconstituting itself in Iraq, and then the additional power that it gained in Syria. Now there were indicators, there were actually assembly areas established that were clearly visible to unclassified satellites and sensors, and I remember seeing those and provided those by the Institute for the Study of War and others prior to the attacks back into northern and western Iraq. But this identifying these again, we were a bit surprised in Helmand a few years ago, as I said, when that sanctuary was identified and ultimately destroyed. How much more difficult is it going to be if you have far fewer people, if you have inevitably fewer platforms and capabilities, and it's much more difficult to respond as well.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And the second half of Larry's question, I think you pretty much addressed as well, which is, can you compensate for the loss of on-the-ground awareness and face-to-face assets with the technological means that are available?
You can, but it's hard, especially if you don't get a base in the region, which doesn't appear to be coming soon to a theater near us. And if it does come, may or may not allow armed capabilities. So again, you can do a lot, but it actually costs even more than it was costing if you had bases right on the ground in 2 or 3 different weather pattern areas, if you will. So we always wanted to have multiple bases, because if one gets weathered in, and weather is a serious issue in Afghanistan, especially certain times of the year, you want to be able to fly them out of another location. So again, it's just vastly harder, and it will literally be vastly more expensive and much less sustainable than would have been just sustaining what we had on the ground, noting that we didn't even have a battle loss casualty in the past year. Now, perhaps a bit because we had the agreement with the Taliban that may have been, undoubtedly was a contributing factor. But we've lost far more soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and so forth in training accidents in recent years than we have lost in the battlefield. So it seems to me we have gotten this down to what is a more sustainable cost, noting that every single one of those losses obviously is a real tragedy for the family involved.
Right, absolutely. Nick, any final questions from you? This has just been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I think has given us so much to think about. What have we missed?
Well, I suppose, I mean, this, as I say, it's been a pretty sobering conversation and a very rich conversation. I understand less why the president has taken the decision now than I did before I started speaking to General Petraeus.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's an interesting point. And again, I don't literally do not do domestic politics. I literally don't even register, support, contribute to candidates. I will engage with candidates and offer thoughts to candidates of either party and those in office of either party. But clearly it seems to be that this is certainly linked to campaign promises, even though now President Biden always said as candidate Biden, we should end endless wars, and he would add, responsibly.
Mm-hmm.
And one can actually challenge again if that is true in this case. But again, there was a determination, I think, to take this action, to show the kind of decisiveness and frankly, it's to keep, by and large, certain elements of that party with them for the much bigger stuff. And again, I acknowledge all of this, and that even when I was offering again options and a recommendation to presidents of either party, by the way, I used to always note that my advice would be based on the facts on the ground, the mission you've given us, the realities. It'll be informed by an awareness of all the other issues that you legitimately have to concern yourself with, like domestic politics, Capitol Hill politics, coalition politics, strain on the force, the opportunity cost of, again, troops in Afghanistan, vice out in the Indo-Pacific, budget deficits, you name it. There's many, many issues beyond the purview of somebody who is riveted on a particular theater of war. And that is the case here, because again, my perspective really largely is being informed by that of having been, again, a commander of two combat theaters, and then of course the overall region as well as an intelligence chief. So, but there are broader concerns. Presumably, that is what has driven this particular decision. And I understand that fully. And by the way, I respect that decision because I'm told it was a very, very tough one. And they recognize it. And the military was listened to very much, and the Secretary of Defense and others. I mean, there was apparently a very rich conversation. But at the end of the day, tough decisions are made. And again, I fully respect that decision. And I hope that my fears turn out to be unfounded. But I fear that they actually may be.
I should note as well that we did request Kurt Campbell, who is really focused on some of these issues. We also requested Jake Sullivan to join us for the summit, but they were unable to join due to schedule conflicts. But we do hope to host them in the future for a broader discussion about this, because I kind of agree with Nick. I've been following, the U.S. media coverage of this decision, and the president, of course, had a press conference, and still I'm scratching my head a little bit. So I do think there's more clarity that can be brought to this conversation in the future. Any final thoughts for us, General? You've been very generous with your time today. I
mean, there is one final thought, and that is bravo to you and to Nick and to Brad for bringing together this particular conference. And it's already been very informative and thoroughly enjoyed it, and it's characteristically, as you say, rich and nuanced and very productive. So great to both of you, and also to Brad and the others behind the scenes for pulling all of this together.
Sir, thank you. We very much appreciate that, as much as we appreciate you sharing all of your insights with us. So thank you. We look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you.